Our topic tonight, the topic for the entire book of Exodus is the Exodus. Okay, so for these 40 chapters, the title of that, the Exodus, and the first two letters, EX, we're talking about the exit of the Israelites out of Egypt. That is the centerpiece of the book. Now, there are many stories in Exodus that have kind of, they're common, they're well known to the church. They would adorn our children's books and children's Bibles, right? Many of our stories in Exodus are our children's Bibles. Our children would be familiar with them, okay? But the one that is the centerpiece of the book of Exodus is the Exodus. In other words, coming out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea. That's the centerpiece of the book. Now, tonight, we have the first few chapters of that, and so our topic for tonight is the call of Moses. So we have the birth of Moses and the call of Moses, just an introduction to this main character who is going to be the main character now for the next 4 books of the Bible. So, I want to start by reading a little bit here. We're going to read a little bit of the Bible. And I'm actually going to start at the end of Genesis. So we wrapped this up last week. The end of Genesis, chapter 50, beginning in verse 24. Now, the reason I'm reading this is because I want you to get a sense of the seamlessness from Genesis to Exodus. Okay? Traditionally, we ascribe the authorship of these 5 books to Moses. Okay? But I want you to get a sense of the seamlessness from the end of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus. Genesis chapter 50, beginning verse 24, Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land he swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. Joseph died at the age of 110. They embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, which came with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of Jacob's descendants was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation eventually died. You see how we're just continuing the story. Boom. They all eventually died, everybody in that generation. But the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous so that the land was filled with them. A new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them, otherwise they will multiply further. And when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. So here we see in Exodus chapter 1 the setting of this story. Now I'm going to call it a story. I don't mean by that it's not real. It's real. It's historical, but it is a narrative. There are stories here that we will go through. Okay, and so the setting of the story is Egypt, and years have passed. It doesn't say how many years. We'll come back to that in a minute. But years have passed since Joseph, and that whole generation died. Now there are many of these Israelites, but the Egyptians are now enslaving them and oppressing them these years later. And so the setting involves these things. Israelites become slaves to the Egyptians. They continue to grow in number. Pharaoh says to the midwives, kill all the baby boys. But the midwives refuse, and they give the excuse that the Hebrew women are too fast and vigorous in the way that they give birth. And so then Pharaoh commands his people, all the people, to throw the male infants into the Nile River. That is the setting into which our main character comes. So in chapter 2, we are introduced to the main character again of these next 4 books of the Bible: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, this guy that we know as Moses. Now, we don't learn his name right off the bat, however. There is an infant boy born to a Levite family. Moses and his siblings, 2 siblings, come from or descend from Levi, that tribe. Now, when one of us or somebody today reads the Bible for the first time, and they say, Moses was born to the Levites, was of the tribe of Levi, you might just take that and say, okay, well, that's just a piece of information. But the original audience of this, in other words, the Israelites, the Jewish people, this is being recorded for them to remember the stories as they happened. Okay, when they hear that he's born into a Levite family, what does that mean to us? In chapter 2 of Exodus, it doesn't mean anything yet. But the Israelites who are hearing this story immediately say what? He is in the line of priests and Levites. Okay, this is a priestly function. They're expecting something priestly coming here. Okay, and so, take that. Okay, all right. So, he's born to this Levite family. And again, Pharaoh has said, we're going to throw all the baby boys in the river. Okay, and so Moses' mother doesn't want that, neither does anybody else. But she crafts this basket and puts pitch and so forth so it will stay afloat, but puts it on the bank of the Nile River in the reeds. Now, Pharaoh's daughter comes and finds this basket, opens it up, and there's Moses, and she adopts, essentially, this baby. Okay? Now, quickly, a couple words here that are interesting, to me at least. I thought they were interesting. 2 words. Depending on what translation you read this in, you may have missed this. She put him in an ark. The basket, this woven basket that she made and put him in this and put him in the reeds, what is called an ark. It is the same word as Noah's ark. And so it's an ark, and it's placed into the reeds on the bank of the Nile River. Okay, the word reed is significant too. So ark and reeds. I just want to talk just for a second about these 2 words. First of all, Moses is placed into this ark and put on the bank of the river, and along comes Pharaoh's daughter and rescues him, right? In other words, this is a continuation. This is a pattern. We have all these patterns. We've seen many patterns in Genesis. Here's, I guess, the first that we've seen in Exodus. This is a Noah-like story. Now, again, when I say story, I'm not saying it's a myth. I'm saying it's real, but it's a Noah-like. He's continuing in this pattern. Now, let's remember, Pastor Bud mentioned baptism just a second ago. Let's remember what we learned earlier about Noah's Ark and how we brought that into the New Testament. 1 Peter 3, 20 and 21, that an ark is a pattern. The ark is Noah's Ark specifically, is a pattern of baptism. So there's bringing that in, okay? There's a baptism element here with this ark of Moses now. In 2 Peter 2, beginning in verse 9, Peter again is talking about how God saved Noah and some other people too, but God saved Noah specifically from the flood. And he says, God knows how to deliver the godly and reserve punishment for the unjust. Okay? Pharaoh was after Moses and these other Israelites. And in the end, it's actually the case that not only does God rescue Moses from this situation, but he uses Moses to totally turn the whole thing on its head and bring the Israelites out of Egypt. Now, the other word I mentioned is the word reeds. Okay? The Hebrew word for reeds, he's placed in this ark in the reeds. Well, the word for reed is the same word that's used when the Bible talks about them crossing the Red Sea. Red, the word red, okay? It's really the word reed. So you can translate Red Sea there as Sea of Reeds. Now, some people will take this in the wrong direction. Let me explain what I mean by that. There are all kinds of people who make it their mission in life to try to dumb down or de-emphasize all of the glorious things in the Bible and the mighty works of God and the miracles. Okay? And so they will say things like, because this is translated Reed Sea or Sea of Reeds, it means that they didn't actually cross the Red Sea. They crossed this other place that was up north that was less significant. It was a smaller body of water. In other words, they're trying to minimize the miracle of God. That's not the right approach, okay, to this point of this reed, okay? Honestly, I don't really care where they crossed, because we don't know exactly where they crossed the Red Sea. That doesn't matter to me at all. The Bible says that God made a parting of the sea, and they went across on dry ground, and when they got across, Pharaoh's army came, and he covered them back up and drowned them. That had to be a pretty big size water. So it doesn't really matter to me where they crossed. We're not using this idea of the Sea of Reeds to kind of downplay God and his role and his miraculous. In fact, I heard it said not too long ago, somebody was talking about how to interpret the Bible. And this fella said the number one rule of Bible interpretation is start with a big God. In other words, don't start interpreting the Bible from a position of trying to show how it could have all been done naturally and minimize and erase all the miracles. You've lost already. Okay? But so that's not where we're going with this, but I want you to see that that's the same word, reeds. So the point being is this: the irony of Moses being placed in the reeds to escape the destruction that was meant for him, and God rescues him out of the reeds to turn right around and use him to take the Israelites out through the reeds. God is very slick like that. Pastor Jeff likes to say chess master, how many thousand? 9,000. Chess master 9,000. God is into those kinds of things, and I just thought that was a neat bit there. No, here we go. Pharaoh's daughter finds this ark. She keeps Moses. Then watch this. Moses' sister is there, and she comes up. Hey, you found this little boy. Would you like me to go find a Hebrew mother to nurse this little baby for you, and then we'll bring him back to you? And she says yes. And not only does she say yes, but she says, I'll pay you for it. Now, if I had somebody on the organ, I could preach that. Because not only will God return to you what the enemy is trying to steal from you, but he may very well take money out of that guy's pocket and put it in yours on top of it. Interest. Amen? All right, so Moses' mother gets baby Moses back for a while, and so that's a good thing. They take him to Pharaoh's daughter. She raises him in the royal atmosphere. She also names him Moses. The name Moses sounds like drawing him out of the water, which is what she did. All right, now let me read a little bit more. We're in chapter 2, verse 11. Years later, doesn't say how many years, but we'll come back to that. Years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you attacking your neighbor?" "Who made you a commander and judge over us?" the man replied. "Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses became afraid and thought, "What I did is certainly known." When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. Okay, so we get kind of Act 2 here. In the middle of chapter 2, years later, Moses is a man. He goes to Midian, and we have this story of him coming to a well, and he meets these ladies at the well. We've kind of heard this before, haven't we? We've heard this twice already, actually. So there's this another pattern that Moses is following in. And so he is introduced now to this fella, Reuel. There are some names here that come in different shapes and forms. Reuel later is called Jethro. Horeb, which is the mountain of God, is later called Sinai. These are the same places, and that is the same person. Okay, so Jethro, the priest of Midian, gives Moses one of his daughters, Zipporah, for a wife, and they have a son, Gershom. Now, Jethro, the priest of Midian, is another interesting little connection. First of all, he's a priest. Moses will become a priest. I mean, he starts the whole Levi thing in terms of the Levite tradition, priests and Levites. And so he's coming to the priest of Midian. But there's another piece here, which is that Jethro the Midian, it was the Midians who took Joseph to Egypt. And so now it's a Midian who is receiving Moses out of Egypt. That is not by accident there. Okay? So Moses now has a wife. He's got a father-in-law, and he's tending some sheep. We've seen that before. Okay? Tending sheep for Jethro here at the end of chapter 2. And meanwhile, that Pharaoh died and a new Pharaoh took his place. Chapter 3 now, we get the story of the burning bush, which everyone's familiar with. But let's go through it here. We'll get a couple of points, I think, that will be interesting for you. Moses is tending the flock. He brings the flock to Horeb, the mountain of God, later to be called Sinai. And while he's there, he notices a bush that is burning, but it's not being consumed. God speaks to him from the bush and says, "Moses, Moses." And Moses says, "Here I am." God says, "Don't come any closer. Take your shoes off. This is holy ground." Then God says this, "I've heard the cry of my people. I am intervening to bring them to the land that I promised them." So here we have a continuation of this promise that we've talked about so much in Genesis. And the command to Moses is, "Go to Egypt. I am sending you to Pharaoh, and I'm going to do a work here. I'm going to get the people out." But really, he just begins with, tell him that the Israelites are to go out and sacrifice to me. And so we begin to get some questions and murmuring and excuses. Moses is reluctant to do what God says. He says, "Who am I to do this thing?" And so there's several of these back and forth here between Moses and God on this question of who am I and who are you? The next thing he asks God is, hey, when I get to Egypt and I start telling these Israelites, God told me all this stuff and blah, 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 they're going to ask me what is his name. Now, the name in this culture and time and tradition is almost synonymous with nature. We have so many names, right, where the person is named that thing and then they become that thing. Or God names them something because there's a special meaning behind that name and it's that nature. So the name and the nature. So when we talk about the name of God, you can almost substitute the nature of God. Okay? But what is his name is what Moses asks God. They're going to want to know what your name is. And God says, "I am who I am." Now, we've talked about this before, but it's been a while, so let me quickly talk just a minute about I am. God says, I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you. If the name is the nature of that person, the nature of that being, when someone asks for the name, they're asking for the nature. In other words, the Israelites will be asking, who is this guy? What is he about? Describe him. And God says, I am. If I said, describe Leonard, well, you wouldn't say I am, first of all, but you would describe him in things like adjectives. Well, he's such and such years old, he's such and such height, he's such and such weight, color of hair, etc., etc. We use adjectives to describe, or we use prepositions like he's from, where are you from? Colorado. He's from Colorado. Okay. God does not, when Moses says, what's your name? He doesn't come back with adjectives and prepositions. He doesn't talk about where he's from. And he doesn't describe himself with adjectives. This is what I'm like. Because how can God say what he's like? He has to come in with the best he can do, which is, I am a noun, a pronoun, a personal pronoun. Am, a verb that is to exist. The personal pronoun tells us that he's a personal God. And the to be verb, I am, I exist, his name is setting himself apart from everyone else, from every other God and from every other created thing. So when he says, I am, in other words, I am the one existing one, he's really saying, I exist in a way nobody or anything else exists. It's a totally other way of existence, and we cannot fathom it. I, the personal God, am. Here's what, then he says, you can tell them also this, Yahweh or Jehovah. This is the proper name of God. The proper name of God, Yahweh or Jehovah. You can also tell them that Yahweh sent you, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So now the proper name Yahweh or Jehovah means this, according to some of the lexicons and different people that try to define these things. They say it's this, the existing one, the self-existent or eternal. What I think is happening here, this is just me talking. I think when we talk about Yahweh or Jehovah, the proper name of God, we can say that name carries the nature of God, which is I am. I think these things are put in proximity to each other. I am and Yahweh. When we say Jehovah, when we say Yahweh, I think we can think, because what does that mean? Okay? I think we can say that it maybe not means, but it carries the nature of I amness. All existent, self-existent, God exists and you don't. It's not that you don't exist, but in the way and in the plane that he exists, which we can't even comprehend, we don't even measure. Okay. Chapter 4, Moses says, what if they don't believe me? God says, what's in your hand? He says, it's a staff. Throw it on the ground. He throws it on the ground, becomes a snake. Okay. That's a pretty cool miracle. Moses is startled. He starts running away. He says, no, grab it by the tail. He grabs it by the tail. It becomes a staff. So that's miracle number 1. He says, if that doesn't work, put your hand in your coat and take it out and it's leprous. Put it back in. Take it out again. It's nice and clean hand. Okay? And if that doesn't work, he says, God says this to Moses, take some water out of the Nile River, throw it on the ground, it'll become blood. So he gives him God gives Moses three miraculous elements that he can use to show the Israelites that God means business. Still, Moses says, but, I can't speak very well. And now God actually gets mad. But he says, you got a brother named Aaron. He speaks fine. Go get him and go take care of this. And so he does. And that's where we'll pick up next week, where he goes to do the business that God has called him to. All right. All right. That is Exodus 1-4-ish. Second look, it will be real quick here, but I just want to bring out something here. Another New Testament passage that refers back to this passage in Exodus. And it comes from Hebrews chapter 11. We keep coming back to Hebrews, and there's a reason for it. It's because the book of Hebrews has probably the most to say of any of the New Testament books of bringing the Old Testament into the New. And so let's take a look at Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 23. I'm going to read a few verses, and then I'm going to make a point, and then that'll be that. Beginning in verse 23, Hebrews 11, it was by faith, this is the Hall of Faith chapter, that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's command. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now that's a little bit of a new piece as well. Basically, he is relinquishing the rights or relinquishing that relationship with the Egyptian, with Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 25, he chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of, watch this, enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. That is a new word, not new for our whole study, but new in terms of an association here, which is the point I want to make here, between sin and Egypt. Let's keep reading. Verse 26, he thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going, because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. I simply want to talk for just a minute about this idea of sin being a key component of the story. We didn't get that in Exodus, okay? He is leaving Egypt. When Moses leaves Egypt, in fact, when Moses kills the Egyptian. Many times I've thought of that as being murder and wrong. Many of the things that I looked at said almost just the opposite. Moses is an instrument of God's justice in that moment. And so we might want to rethink I don't know how you think about it, but how we look at that event of Moses killing that guy. Was it murder, or was it an instrument of divine justice? In other words, was he God's man in that moment? Not totally sure I know, but some people argue that way. The point is this: when he leaves Egypt, he is leaving behind the old way. But the old way is more than just where he was raised and putting aside the riches and easy life. It's more than that. According to this, he's putting away sin. He chooses to leave behind sin / Egypt and go out. Okay? This is the first time that we get this idea that Egypt can represent sin. We talked about a couple weeks ago Egypt as a place of coming to for protection and provision. Remember that? Egypt was a source of protection and provision. That is true. But it's also true that Egypt can be seen as a place of sin and bondage. And so it's someplace we want to get out of. Even the ones who went to Egypt for protection and provision wanted to get out at some point. But when you're there, it's a place of sin and it's a place of bondage. And so when we come out of Egypt, a few chapters later and a couple weeks later, a couple weeks for us. When we come out of Egypt, that is analogous to what in the new covenant? Coming out of sin. In other words, that's a salvation coming across the Red Sea. We think of that in terms of new covenant as coming out of Egypt, coming out of sin, being saved, coming into the newness of God. All right. So I just wanted to point out that this idea that in Hebrews where sin is now a component of Moses is leaving behind this life of sin, never to return. All right. Finally, the application tonight. Again, I want you to read a couple of passages and have a quick discussion. Here are the passages. Matthew 23:12, Philippians 2:3, and Acts 8:18 through 21. I recommend you kind of splitting that up, having maybe each person read. But here is the prompt. Contrast Moses' approach to Simon's. In the Acts chapter 8, we're going to learn about a character named Simon. And I want you to contrast the approach of Moses, which was reluctant to do what God asked, to Simon's approach. Now, here are the questions. What kind of attitude is God looking for? What if you do have a desire to be used by God? Is that necessarily a bad thing? And then what examples of any of these approaches can you share with the group? Okay, so take a few minutes and discuss that.